Chapter 1. The Artifact. Today marked the anniversary. Today also marked the 7th week of the terrible task she had been forced to assign Scarlet. She remembered the days since as fragments. She remembered the hours involving that wretched artifact as eternity. A small sigh passed through her lips. She should not allow that thing to burden her thoughts today. Then again, this was a day of solemnity and reflection. Even though she could hardly reflect when she could hear her two advisors squabbling outside in her antechamber. For now, she had to treasure this rare moment of solitude until its inevitable end. She vacantly stared through the window pane at the masses that had gathered outside. Purples and silvers and blues muddled together until their emergence resembled a waterlogged painting. Or perhaps a painting viewed through teary eyes. Fairies throughout the kingdom had been flocking to the capital for the last few days, as was the annual custom of the Ravikari. Storytellers, musicians, and performers benefited from the overflow of people by each recounting the ancient war they had come to commemorate. They also told stories prior to those events, the golden times when everything and everyone prospered. It was a time before darkness descended upon all throughout the worlds. It was a time before the witch came. It saddened her to think that, after all these millennia, the past still haunted and affected them like a stubborn scar. A scar now festering with that artifact close by, and ever closer in her thoughts. Great Kyra above, we have been through enough. Why does that witch insist on inflicting upon us more torment? She loathed keeping such a dark secret within the castle, hidden from her subjects. If they knew, there would be no merry dances to the jigs playing outside the castle walls. The blissfulness of ignorance was a very effective thing indeed. Envious even, but also dangerous if taken for granted. A knock came at her door, and there ended her reflection. Yule, she said to permit entry, bracing herself as she turned to face her visitors. The two advisors entered like approaching thunderclouds. It was ironic, if anything. As much as the two of them claimed to adhere to their stoic beliefs of Guhulen, the debates between them grew heated to the point that she could swear their auras were charging the atmosphere. Her first advisor, Sia, was a woman older than her and, if she remembered correctly, was nearing her 3,000th Vitany. Those years of life were already beginning to show by the wrinkles creasing that stern face, her wings no longer youthfully erect. Slenarquea, said Sia. That wrinkling face now totters her lips like in her younger days. Of course Sia would tell her that she didn't believe it would be safe in that place anymore. Surely she knew she was aware of that. Selenar's gaze drifting to the door from which they had entered, she conveyed that very thought in their native tongue of Slavisk. Guerotozim. Her second advisor, Aru, was a blonde-haired man who was currently staring at her with icy blue eyes. His diaphanous wings matched the color of those eyes, and they now quivered behind him in barely concealed agitation. Ferut kunjim, semeri yulini, he asked, his voice more composed than his body. A muscle in her jaw twitched. Why did she do nothing, he asked? Why did she needlessly entangle herself with an artifact that shouldn't be in their domain? Perhaps because if she truly did do nothing, this very artifact would eventually bring calamity to their domain, one way or another. Still, she remained silent. You needn't keep it with the fairies any longer, Kybril, Sia agreed in their language, using the honorific given to the fairy monarch. The elves have already offered to take it from our hands. I would think it wise to accept their proposition. She took a step closer to Selenar and added lowly, Think of this. The addition of another artifact will only make us a more attractive target in that witch's eyes. Forget not what has passed several hundred years ago. Believe me, I do not forget those events as I do not forget the events we observe today. But the seers have already confirmed that the witch has knowledge of our discovery, and have seen ominous repercussions if we were to relocate that object, said Selenar. Sia tilted her head at her. And if we were to keep it, The odds are more favorable if we were to keep it here. Will you leave your kingdom to the whims of the fates, then? Sia asked with a slight note of reproach. The fates have been known to be unkind, Kybril. Yet Kyra commands them, and he is not unkind. Silinar rubbed her brow, her head aching. My actions may be mere folly, and yet one could also counter that shifting its position the span of 1,000 miles is also folly. Only through teleportation devices could such transportation be deemed prudent. However, you both know well that the portal stream is severed, no doubt by the witch's doing. Aru's wings fluttered. So you will keep it here, Kybril? For the moment, yes. Then what of this assembly you have now called for? He asked. I have called for a Korean assembly so the other monarchs of this world and I may decide the artifact's ultimate fate. If it is deemed that it should not stay here, it shall be done as decreed. He regarded her silently for a heartbeat. Then he said, You should know I also came to reports that we have word from Nexura. Silinar tensed. What has Nexura to say? Nexura will not be able to attend the assembly, and if you had already entertained the thought, do not call for a universal conference as of yet. Only the world of Korea, at the moment, will be involved with the artifact, Ada reported. The first part did not surprise her. That eldritch being was unfathomable. Sia was furrowing her brow. Why contain this problem in Korea? That demonic thing was not discovered in this world to begin with. Neither were its origins here. Kybril, this is, if anything, absurdity on our part, she said, addressing the last words to Silinar. Aru nodded his head. My queen, I am in accord with Sia. Should fates have mercy, the artifact reactivate, we shall undoubtedly be caught in the crossfire. Nexura does not possess the final word, and neither is that being in charge of our kingdom. Silinar laughed mirthlessly. Great Kyra above, Aru. Our kingdom, along with the other world, may very well fall into peril if this matter is not attended to, and if the witch should come to retrieve it. As Aru opened his mouth to speak, Silinar held up a hand and continued. Aru, please respect our differences and do recall that I am a firm believer in Ezuno. Every action, or inaction, that I do, that we as a kingdom do, will be balanced in a reward or a punishment. Such is the way of the universal scales. In any case, Nexura had often supported her throughout the years of her reign with sage counsel. If only that being would have advised her what to do with the artifact now. Ah, what a naive wish. She should know by now never to be dependent on Nexura. Clear notes, like the hum of crystal glasses, suddenly filled the lull in the conversation. Sia went into the folds of her robes and produced a crystal disc emitting a maroon glow, no larger than her palm. The advisor stared at the glow a moment before rubbing the surface with the knuckle of her forefinger. The crystal surface had, up until now, reflected Sia's face in a maroon-tinged light. After Sia had rubbed it, the reflection began to muddle and ripple as though her knuckles had touched water. When the disc cleared, a dark-haired woman stared back at Sia with wide brown eyes. I must speak with Kybril, she whispered. Is she with you? Silinar froze, clutching the windowsill behind her. She knew from that tone the nature of what this woman had to report. All the same, Sia passed the disc to Silinar, who composed herself and gazed directly at the crystal into the woman's eyes. What is it, Scarlet? Many apologies, my queen, for interrupting your preparations, but I must report a change in the artifact's activity. She could feel the blood draining from her face, only intensifying the chill that had seized her. What has passed? Was all she could utter. Then Silinar held up a hand. No, wait. I must see it for myself. We will finish this conversation when I get there. Scarlet held a breath. Truly? Yes, I will see you forthwith. Until then. Silinar rubbed the knuckle of her forefinger into the glass, causing the image to waver, and the glow flickered out. When the disc's surface stilled, Silinar saw only her reflection. She turned to Sia. You are far more adept than me at the art of teleportation, I believe. As she had expected, Aru protested with, There is hardly time to visit Scarlet now. You must perform the annual ceremony. I have half of the hour remaining, she told him, and this most certainly cannot wait. Sia eyed her warily, before heaving a sigh of submission. As you wish, Kybril. I will take us to the greenhouses. The advisor spread out her hands then, and murmured a few words, the silver lights of time magic flashing within her palms. A silver ring glowed into existence at their feet, expanding as it hummed the arcane and ancient tune of magic. The light filled Selenar's vision until she could no longer see Aru's disapproving frown, nor the room they were standing in. The spell lasted only for the fraction of a second. When the red spots stopped dancing before her eyes, Selenar saw that she was no longer in her chambers. In fact, it was not a room but a passageway, glass walls to both sides, with doors leading to different rooms. The Garden of Slough. On any regular day, these greenhouses would be bustling with gardeners, and these walls would serve as windows for the nobility who wanted to come and view the plants. But today was not a regular day. Both the nobility and most of the gardeners had gone to observe the Ravikari. With an exchange of glances, Sia and Selenar began their way down the passageway in silence, while preoccupying themselves with the displays through the glass. Plants of all kinds could be found here, ranging from rare to common, exotic to native, beautiful to grotesque, tropical to arctic. The rooms they saw were structured to receive varied amounts of sunlight, some rooms operating under spelled sunlight when needed. Selenar saw a gardener through the glass tending to a bulbous plant in a room with light snowfall. The frost on the pane of glass framed a large ivory flower bud that appeared much too large for the delicate leaves and stem that supported it. If only they had come for such a mundane plant. In a way, she was glad Sia could not teleport them the whole way. As they continued walking, she found she desired conversation, even though Sia wasn't a woman to offer one. Recalling her recent discussion with her two advisors, Selenar muttered, "You Guhuleni and your lack of empathy." Sia chuckled to Selenar's mild surprise, and she knew it wasn't for her sake. Selenar added humouredly, "I suppose that's one thing I can appreciate about your set of beliefs. You would hardly ever be a sycophant." "Ah, Selenar, I'll agree with you to a degree. Ara believes in Guhulen far more than I, so we cannot understand why you would allow your compassion for foreigners to sway your judgment and your responsibility to your people." Selenar rolled her eyes slightly. "Yet he too is swayed by emotion. That is one of the many things I will never understand of your philosophy." Sia tilted her head. "It is not such an easy thing to explain. Mortal kind are a very complex set of beings, my queen, and so mortal-made constructs like ideas will also be very complex and nuanced. Still," she said, and Selenar sensed the return of the dreaded subject as Sia lowly continued, "This is why I urge you again to reconsider relinquishing that object to the elves. We already have one demonic artifact in our care, another which is not tied to our world, but your great-grandfather voluntarily took custody of it when the Universal Conference thought it prudent for the fairies to safekeep it, and you know full well how dearly we paid for that decision." "We shall find a way to destroy that thing," said Selenar, wishing she could feel as confident as her words. Sia must have caught that discrepancy, because she challenged it with, "Destroy it? How would he propose that, when it is practically suicidal tampering with—" She held up a finger, and Sia stopped. "It is best," Selenar said softly, looking directly at her advisor, "not to speak of such matters in the dark." The lighting about them had darkened, for they were no longer in the Garden of Slough, the greenhouses that held the plants that flourished in light. The plants in this section thrived in the darkness. That factor alone was why this part of the greenhouses was called the Garden of Durm. They encountered no one as they walked down the passageway that had veered off its straight path and now winded left and right into murkiness. So dim and dank had their surroundings become that Sia placed heat charms on both of them and led the way with the small white orb of light she produced from her raised palm. As soon as she had created the light, rustles came from the glass walls on both sides of them. Selenar looked to her right and caught glimpses of thick red vines slithering across the glass. She realized then that the vines were slithering away from the two of them, away from the light. Their revolting movement made her inwardly shudder, and even though she did not see any more of the dark flora, she still heard the scrabbles and hisses in the darkness, smelled the vile sulphurous odors. Even though she'd been here before, these plants still unnerved her to no end. She could not understand how they could be plants, when they loathed the light and warmth that gave life to their familiar counterparts. Such were the twisted properties of black magic. At long last they stopped at a certain glass door. Soft light bled through the glass, brightening their dusky surroundings the tiniest fraction. Sia stepped forward and pushed the door open for her, and Silinar walked inside. What she first registered was the room's warmth and brightness. The glass house she entered was a dome-like structure dazzled by the light of the ending day. She knew this to be the true daylight, for twilight had been fast approaching when she and Sia had left her chambers. Gardening tools and loam sacks lay strewn on the floor near them, the soil spilling out from one sack. Looking further in, she saw countless plants hanging from pots overhead and others placed upon tables of polished oak carefully arrayed into rows. A good number of the flora was undoubtedly carnivorous. She spotted one plant with a gaping mouth of scarlet teeth-like petals, another with elongated black thorns constantly groping for prey to impale. Silinar was still looking at the strange specimens when she heard fluttering wings within the rows of plants. Scarlet emerged, hovering several inches above the ground, and even when she set herself down on the floor, it took a few moments for her wings to cease their anxious flutter. She was huffing slightly as she combed at the strings of dark hair plastered to her sweaty face. Then Scarlet smoothed her blue robes, straightened her sash of a darker hue, and said, "A good evening to you, my queen. I must apologize. I'm dreadfully indecent." Silinar offered a smile she did not feel. "Nonsense. Your line of work demands much." As Scarlet said her thanks, Sia dismissed herself with a bow, giving Silinar the creeping notion that her advisor sensed her anxiousness to privately speak with Scarlet. Still, Silinar nodded her assent and asked for her scepter to be brought to her for the ceremony, to which Sia said with a faint smirk flickering on her lips, "If I do not deliver it myself, it will be because Aru went in my stead." With that, she bowed her head to her queen and departed. Silinar half wished she had brought the scepter with her. The ancient relic was a wonderful supplement to her magic, and would have given her the security she wanted. Her father had wielded it before her grandfather before him, and before him her great-grandfather, who had taken the other artifact into his charge. She pondered on Sia's words, wondered if he would have approved of her decision to take another one into the fairy's care. "Great-grandfather Aristi, grandfather Ethri, dear father, guide me now. I fear I've only let more black magic into our house, and I fear the witch will come again to retrieve that magic." She took in a slow breath, suddenly wishing to delay the inevitable conversation. Glancing about the room, she asked, "The others are off at the festivities, I presume?" "Yes, Cabriel." "Ah, Scarlet, your dedication to your work is admirable. I thank you." Silinar turned her gaze to the light filtering through the glass. She asked, "I am curious, Scarlet. If the Garden of Durham houses plants of the darkness, why does the light enter this room?" Scarlet's wings were fluttering in edginess. None the less, she answered, "This glass house holds the plants of twilight, the plants that desire little light. The twilight is a period of transition, my queen, a period in which species of the light and darkness may coexist. During the high daylight hours, the glass is spelled to dispel the light. Only around this time in the early morning hours is the spell inactive." "I see. Would the spell glass also possess the properties to dispel sound from within?" she asked. "I suppose it should—" "Ah!" Understanding dawned on Scarlet's face, and then regret. "Cabriel, I am not acquainted with—" "Oh, Scarlet, please disregard proper etiquette. If you know not the magic, then I shall perform it. I will not collapse of fatigue as decorum likes to imply," said Silinar. She then raised her hands to the glass walls. The hum of magic could be heard, though its globe remained unseen. The air began to tremble, and the glass began to vibrate, causing the dwindling daylight to flicker and shimmer before their eyes. The spell of soundlessness was completed within seconds. Scarlet's fidgeting stilled with the air, folding her hands at her waist as she waited upon Silinar. Silinar then realized her own rigid posture. Forcing her muscles to relax, she proceeded to walk down the 6th row and softly asked Scarlet, "What has passed?" Scarlet clenched her robe, her eyes downcast as she recounted what had transpired. "Dear Kyra, it was awakening," Silinar remarked. "It spoke to you in Crean." "Yes, my father is Crean, so I know the language, my queen." That would explain her Crean name. Silinar dismissed the fleeting thought and asked, "Did you feel compelled to do so?" "Certainly not, my queen. Whatever resides within the rose is fortunately not yet capable of compulsion." That revelation, at least, was a stroke of fortune. Silinar smiled weakly. Every person knowledgeable of the rose tried to call it anything other than what it essentially was, like an unwritten rule and a fear of subsequent punishment if broken. The poor woman following beside her was visibly shaky. "Dear queen, what have you given me? Forgive me, you told me of its ties to the ancient war, but you plainly spoke not all. How am I to investigate the specimen when you tell me so little?" Silinar tried to keep her voice even. "My silence is not out of churlishness, Scarlet. Believe me." Scarlet was too involved with that thing as it was. Deeper knowledge would only further ascertain misfortune's gaze upon the gardener, and consequently upon the kingdom. Now she had the uneasy feeling that she should have aimed the spell of soundlessness within the glass house rather than around it. She could sense its presence even without seeing it, its chilling aura far intenser than the cold she had encountered on her walk here, and only strengthening as the light and its warmth waned. Then she reached the end of the row, and could now see those lustrously dark petals, could see the enchantment on its encasement, its glass prison. A feeble prison, although not for its physical fragility. "I understand your research is impeded," said Silinar, "but all the same, have you come upon any findings? Any theories as to how it may be destroyed? I had hoped your dealings with plants of black magic might aid your study of this particular specimen." Scarlet shook her head ruefully. "I regret to tell my queen that I have not. It is like holding a living viper to dissect without being struck. I have never encountered a specimen like this. It is not a plant. It is unnatural," she informed Silinar. It was unnatural. Staring at the flower, she couldn't be relieved when she found no alarming signs of surging power. "It is not enough," Silinar said, shaking her head. "Alas, time and not I wishes to press you, Mistress Scarlet. What lies within desires to awaken, yearns for freedom." Silinar put a hand on the woman's shoulder, giving as much reassurance as she could through the contact, as she said, "I know overseeing this artifact is dangerous. No harm shall befall you. I will see to it that the number of guards posted here is doubled." Scarlet bowed her head. "I thank you, Cabril." She pitied the woman. Scarlet was sworn into secrecy, while secrets still were kept from her. All the same, she labored to discover a way to destroy the rose, a task Silinar was increasingly afraid she had given her in vain. Silinar looked at her sadly. "Go spend the rest of Ravikari with your kin, Mistress Scarlet. I believe I appointed someone to take your stead." Scarlet blinked. "Nightfall approaches, my queen, and surely after this incident that would be unwise." "It is undoubtedly, but it is far more unwise to leave you in your fatigued condition." Scarlet's shoulders relaxed, obviously expecting her to have agreed with her. She bowed deeply. "Cabril, I am indebted to you," she said, the edge softened from her voice. "I should say I am far more indebted to you, but I must now take my leave of you," she said. "The ceremony must be conducted." "Of course, Queen Silinar. As every year before, you look ravishing," Scarlet complimented with a small bow. In all honesty, Silinar hadn't really looked at herself ever since her maids had finished dressing her, so burdened had she been by her thoughts. She noticed now that they had gowned her in flowing purple robes and elaborately braided golden thread into a couple of her scarlet locks, leaving the rest of her hair to cascade down her back. The maids had done her well. She preferred the looser attire. "May Kyra go with you," said Scarlet as she escorted her to the door. "And may the fates be kind to you," Silinar responded. She raised a hand, and the air quivered again as the spell was dismantled. Scarlet opened the door for her, and there waiting was Aru, with her scepter in his outstretched hands. Apparently, Sia might just have the power of foresight. "My queen," he said to her, bowing as he held out the scepter. "Aru?" She wrapped her fingers around the smooth silver rod, pulling it close to her. The encrusted large diamond-cut amethyst flashed radiantly when the light touched it. "You must have flown with swift wings," she said with some amusement. Aru had never been one for humor. He performed a small frown. "Fly, Cabril, in the enclosed space of the castle. I should never be so ill-mannered. I had a teleporter acquired for me, and as I was already on my way to see you, the trip was not long." "I see," said Silinar, fingering the large jewel absent-mindedly. Scarlet bowed to her and then to Aru, Aru returning the greeting with the incline of his head. Then he turned to Silinar. "Shall we go?" She nodded, and together they departed. "We must make haste, my queen," said Aru, when they were well away from the glass house. He provided a light with one hand when the dimness enclosed them, the other hand at his back. "The ceremony is to begin in 7 minutes." "Very well, Aru." Something in her tone must have caught his attention, because now he stared at her. "You are troubled. What has Scarlet told you?" "There is far more than I dare tell here. I will explain the rest when we all congregate." He nodded then, and offered no more conversation. Meanwhile, anxiety was slowly building up like a torrent within her, a torrent that could very well drown her soon. She could not help but quietly utter to him, 32,000 years, Aru, and still we are ordering the chaos." "You never told Scarlet what would happen if it was freed, have you?" "No." "Then you only told her that it was an evil relic of what happened 32,000 years ago." "Yes, but even I am not fully certain that the legends are true to what they say." His upraised arm stiffened. "The legends are too vague to be reliable." "That is why I relied upon what Nixuda had to say on the matter." "Nixuda was there when it was locked away," said Aru. "How does that being not know how to destroy it?" "Nixuda never discloses all, and never discloses why. Though sometimes I wonder, Aru, if the artifact is not for us but the humans to destroy, as the legend stated." Aru lowered his hand and extinguished his glowing sphere, for light had welcomed them again as they re-entered the Garden of Slew. And yet it was easy to feel that they were still wandering through the dark passageways of the Garden of Durm. He gave her a critical look. "Then all our preemptive measures have been for naught, Cabril. And if matters are dependent on the humans to destroy the object that threatens them, then it will be too late for them and possibly us." Aru paused, glancing ahead at the path before them. "It simply seems too long for old scars to tear wound anew, Cabril. And yet..." So she once had thought, but since its discovery, it occurred to her that perhaps they and the other worlds had fallen into complacency in this period of security. The original intention of the Ravikari to keep them wary, as well as the war's memory, was on the cusp of fading before that complacency. It was for that reason that Silinar now gave him a mirthless smile and finished his statement. "And yet history tends to repeat itself, Aru."